Most of us, perhaps all of us, have wondered about and even wrestled with questions about life. For example, origins. Where did we come from? Or meaning. Does life have a purpose, or do we live a meaningless life and die? Another is morality. Why should we live any particular way at all? Is there an objective morality, or do we make it up as we go? Destiny is another one. What happens after we die? Do we cease to exist when we breathe our last, or do we continue existing in some form, and if so, do we go somewhere? There are many religions and belief systems. What are the areas of agreement and disagreement? Welcome to our merry band at the Fellowship of the Book, as we ponder the big question.
As we ponder the big question, and this is a sort of a special video, and we have with us David Wolcott, who's Assistant Executive Director of Evangelical Missions and Religions, EMNR, and the big guy on the big question is Dr. Corey Miller, President of Ratio Christi, and I want to say he's a good friend, and I'm going to say he's a good friend, and he can correct me if I'm lying. And we do have his book, which I'm going to. No, I'm not going to do it with that. I'm going to do it with this. Bring that up just so people can see it again. Okay. And there it is. Nope. Where is it? That's not it. There it is. The Progressive Miseducation of America. And it's a really important one, I think. We have done a interview on the book earlier, and you've been kind of making runs, haven't you, with this book?
Yeah, I've had about 50 plus interviews on it and speaking around the country on campuses, churches, and conferences. So it's going well. Building some new partnerships, but it's extremely timely. I'll put it that way. The book was released on the birth date of Charlie Kirk's and of George Floyd's. So that sort of takes you in two different trajectories.
Yeah. I was talking with David before we started, because he wants to lead off with something. But before we do that, I had mentioned that some years ago, I haven't done this recently, although I'm open to it, is I would have churches that would bring me in, like several churches would combine together and bring me in for 3 days, and we would just deal with worldviews, what they are. One of my points about that is most of us, our worldview is shaped by osmosis. It sort of just seeps into our brains from sources all around us. We don't even realize it. It comes from the movies we watch, the books we read, the radio we listen to, the peer group we're in. We just believe things because everyone around us believes them without having any filters to check it and say, is this true? So they would bring me in just to deal with their high school kids who were getting ready to go to college. And I would spend 2 days just dealing with the worldview question. And on the third day, we would watch a film. I usually use the film Hidalgo. And their mission was simple: watch the film, enjoy it, eat the popcorn, drink the, soda, whatever. But you need to look and see what the worldviews are in the film and which one is the most honorable, which one is the truest, and which one is the most dishonest. And there are 3 in the film. And at the end of the film, what you kind of discover is the most honorable is Islam. He's reliable, he's honest, and he acknowledges that the animistic worldview, the American Indian character, is what he believes is the truest form of belief. The Christians were the worst. They were thieves, scoundrels, ne'er-do-wells, and always conniving. So as you watch a film like that, you start developing ideas about these religious systems without even thinking about it. And why is that important? Because when you go to college, you're going to be bombarded with a lot of information from those who are teaching you stuff And you hardly ever ask yourself, what is the worldview they're coming from? Because that shapes largely the material they're going to give you. Do you agree or disagree with that?
No, absolutely. When I taught philosophy at Indiana University, I would not self-identify who I was or my commitments other than my name and street credentials that they were concerned with until about mid-semester. And then I would tell them, I've been trying to train you all to become philosophers, not dogmatists and not skeptics, because to be a skeptic, you would have to be skeptical of skepticism, and that's stupid. And to be a dogmatist doesn't really land you in the area of pursuing truth honestly. And so I said, you're all being trained to be philosophers, and you need to recognize that every professor you have here that's got a textbook or not has a doctorate of philosophy in XYZ. That is, they all have a worldview. And so do I. And so it's time, I think, that I disclose to you what my worldview is. And I do that. I think it's honest. I think it's good. I think people should try to figure out what the philosophical presuppositions of an article, a book, an author are coming from, and then be able to identify what their own is as well, so that we can just be honest when we're examining the evidence.
Right. I've been a Christian a long time. I was in construction. I don't know if you may or may know this. I was in construction for 40 years. About 25 of that was my own business. And my clients and contractors and architects that worked with me liked working with me, and it was pretty evident what I believed because I wear my faith on in my life everywhere I go.
Mhm.
And I would have phone calls sometimes from an architect who was an atheist who would call me pretty often, and the first question he would ask me is, I have a difficult client. He was just ripped off pretty badly. I want to find out, are you still a Bible banger? Yes, I'm still a Bible banger. He says, great. I knew they could trust you. Now, he's an atheist,
Hmm.
but he had made decisions about who I am personally based on my history with him. And then he tied that into my faith. So they come together. But so it's what you're saying. Uh, we're talking, we're going to be talking about the book to some degree, but we're talking about particular aspects in the book that we think are important and not really stressed enough probably in most interviews. And that is not only what the problem is, but what are proposed ways to address the problem. And David wanted to start off with a quote on something.
Yeah, so the book, it's 3 parts, and part 1 and 2 covers the revolutions, and I want to give you an opportunity to talk on what the revolution is, but to kind of introduce, or what the 3 revolutions are, but to introduce that, I wanted to start with a quote this is from Alfred Kinsey from Sexual Behavior in the Human Female, pages 273 to 276. The adult males who had approached these pre-adolescent children were identified as follows. And then he presents a series of tables and details. And this is the relevant quote. If a child were not culturally conditioned, it is doubtful it would be disturbed by sexual approaches of the sort which had usually been involved in these histories. And I wanted to start with that because a lot of my research focuses progressive Christianity. A lot of progressive Christians try to push back with, well, that's you personally object to this thing, but there's nothing anti-Christian about it, or there's nothing wrong about it. And so I wanted to give you a couple of minutes to talk about these revolutions in the context of, we disagree with them, but there's also legitimate issues with them that go far beyond merely we have different opinions, and go into legitimate harm is being done. So please take it away for a couple minutes on that, because I know it's a big issue.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people don't know Kinsey, but Kinsey was sort of the research scientist behind the sexual revolution. And the books you're talking about that he wrote in the male and the female were in the 40s and 50s. We're thinking about this, the ideological revolution that transformed the universities in the first case after we had started them and we had been around for 250 years. Those battles on scientific naturalism lasted about 50 years, but by the 1930s, the dust was settling, and the second great revolution was about to happen, and it was starting over in Germany, the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory. From that, we think about critical race theory, critical gender theory, critical pedagogy, critical queer theory, critical iceberg theory. If it's critical and it's not critical thinking, run, because it is Marxism plus whatever topic it's addressing. And so a lot of those founders in that school were Jewish, one, but they were neo-Marxists. They were about broadening Marx's concerns from the focal point, what a lot of people thought Marxism was about, and that was the economic haves and have-nots, the economic disparities. And so economic justice. Now we've got racial justice and climate justice and race justice and every other kind of justice, which assumes a Marxist perspective. But what these neo-Marxists did is they wedded the new race, class, sex, gender, ethnicity, and so forth, all of the categories, with the Marxist main ideology, and they were tapping into Sigmund Freud. And so one of the most famed of those Frankfurt scholars was Herbert Marcuse. Marcuse wrote the book Eros and Civilization, taking off on Freud's civilization and its discontents. But Eros, eroticism, and its and civilization, a philosophical investigation into Freud. So he comes over to the US, in the 30s, because Hitler came to power in 1933. These guys were globalist socialists and they were Jewish. They had to get out of Germany, not a good place to be. They came over to Brandeis, which was Jewish in its inception, to Columbia, to UCLA and other places. And Marcuse is doing his part along with some of his other friends. And Alfred Kinsey is doing his part in Indiana. And my daughter and I, we were looking at Indiana University as one possible school where she could have gone. And we took a tour with the tour guide, and we walk across the Kinsey statue. They have a statue of this guy. And this guy is doing research on like 2-year-olds with erections. And this is just sick stuff. But he's getting all of this education from Freud and, the notion of polymorphous perversity. And now we have Polyamory Day, November 23rd, where we celebrate anything and everything, hate or celebrate, right? But Marcuse is driving this new sexual Marxism, bringing Freud in, and Kinsey is doing the science stuff, the research going all the way back to infants and looking at males and females. And you could say he was sort of the research scientist of it. And you could say that Marcuse was the faculty advisor of the 1960s sexual revolution. And again, this stuff is Marxist in the background, which was built on naturalism, that nature is all that is, was, or ever will be. Marx was part of that naturalist continuum, but his followers took it into a new area. And many of them were also then, by this time, when you get the 40s and the 50s, you're getting the fountainheads of postmodernism that also sent their people over here. And then there were also card-carrying members of the French Communist Party, like Michel Foucault, who, of course, his fourth volume of Humans and Sexuality, I think, just came out posthumously. He didn't want it published while he was still alive. But we find that he was raping immigrant children in France on the tombstones and then throwing money at them after he would finish with them. He died of AIDS, of course. He had a lot of experiences in the brothels in San Francisco, but he and all of his buddies, deconstructionists and Leotard and others, all came over to America, and it was this amalgam of postmodern cultural Marxism. And that's kind of the ideology that we could unpack more, but those are some of the big named players and what was happening in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s.
Thank you very much for that brief overview. And yeah, there's so much, so much deeper we can get into, which you do in your book. And I highly recommend, for the technical study, please, everyone get this and go through it. and then go back and fact check them, because I'm reading some of the stuff that's behind it, and it's worse than what some of the content that these people produce is worse than what he actually provides in the book. Like some of the stuff that Kinsey's written, and these other people, some of their histories. So with that brief overview of some of the revolutions that happened, we want to work starting from the broad scale down to the individual level of through professors, pastors, and parents of the practical. Okay, so this revolution happened. What do we do? So starting with professors, I know you've recently started the Malik Fellowship. Can you expand on that and on the general thing of what can Christian academics do about these revolutions that have happened?
Yeah, the original title of my book, which is now The Progressive Miseducation of America, the original title was The Third Revolution, From the Campus to the Culture and a Vision Forward. The publisher changed the title, but I still am keen with thinking about a third revolution, since we've had two. What is actual entails what is possible. So for those naysayers who say it's impossible, we've just got to follow someone like Rod Dreary, as I call him. And I do like his writings, but I take a little shot at him because he's a defeatist and I'm more of an optimist and a fighter. That's why I've got not just my books, but my combat boots up there, to say that we're not just about Socratic beard strokers, we're about getting things done and doing something about it.
Well,
And,
not only that, just to interrupt you,
yes.
they seem to forget that the church was born in a utterly pagan society and culture, and their beliefs and behavior transformed culture over a 300-year period into Western society. Is there some reason we need to run away from that methodology?
Right. It was a long march through the institutions and starting the institutions that Christians did. And it was that notion that the cultural Marxists picked up from Chairman Mao initially, when he was on the retreat before he made the fast advance and then created communist China. But he talked about the long march. And then Rudi Dutschke, a German neo-Marxist, talked about the long march through the institutions. And then Marcuse, again, picked it up in the 70s, when people like Bernardine Dorn and Bill Ayers were busy bombing police stations and government facilities. And they realized that, the American people at that time, we weren't taking it like we are doing now in our culture, and that we weren't about to accept this violence. And so they thought, okay, we've got to rethink this. The workers of the world unite, that Marx used to talk about, meant the workers on the factory floor, the proletariat, again, a French term, bourgeoisie, French term. Marx and Lenin always looked at the revolution in France, and that was what they salivated over. But the new proletariat, the new revolutionaries, need to be not from the factory floor, but the academic elites in the universities. And that became their modus operandi, is to reclaim ground in the universities methodically, patiently, but consistently over time. And they did so for decades and decades, until this stuff just exploded onto the scene from our standpoint. But from a real historical standpoint, it had been there for some time. So it's not like it hasn't been done before. This stuff does take time.
Right.
And it's happened not just once, but twice. And I interview people in my book that were examples that took over entire institutions, like Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, that Al Mohler came in and removed from it being a liberal institute at the time to a conservative theological one. Or like Alvin Plantinga, the philosopher's philosopher, one of the best philosophers living today, who in the 50s and 60s was so bright he began to start the wake of the boat, and other philosophers jumped on the back in the bandwagon. And before you know it, we've got all these Christian philosophical academic societies. And you get people in 2001, when I was transitioning from theology to philosophy, to go on into the secular universities and to get a PhD, so that I could act like the Trojan horse getting into the city of Troy. It was, I think, in the journal Philo that Quentin Smith, now the belated Quentin Smith, cried a warning call that said, look, in the 60s, Time magazine had this big face cover that said, God is dead. We can no longer say that God is dead in the universities. He resurrected. He established a beachhead in philosophy departments, beginning with Alvin Plantinga and a whole wake behind him. And I think he exaggerates, but he says now we can say that maybe 1/3 of all philosophers in the field of philosophy of religion are conservative Christians. I think he's exaggerating. The point is well taken, though. And he says, imagine, brothers and sisters, if every field starts getting populated by these Christians in psychology and biology and in the humanities and in the hard sciences. Wake up, everybody. There's been a beachhead landing and we need to pay attention to this. In other words, in entire disciplines, in entire institutions, and this has happened multiple times just in the U.S. university. So for the naysayers, it is possible and it must happen. We have no other choice. And so we launched this thing. For decades, I've been working on faculty ministry through Faculty Commons Crew. And then when I came on with Ratio Christi, we started it, but we needed to focus on some other things. But we finally thought, look, there are organizations that have been going for decades, like Alliance Defending Freedom, who have got a 30-year pedigree and how they got Supreme Court justices and federal justices in there, and philosophical master's graduate programs that have been doing it for 30 years. And I've got the statistics on how many of them have gone on to get, tenured track positions at R1 schools. What's an R1 school? Well, that's the highest level of research, not just high research, but highest level. So you've got to have, 50 to 70 or more doctoral programs, everything from Harvard to Purdue and so forth. Now there's about 180 of those out of 40 or out of 4,000 colleges and institutions. So we started this thing called the Malik Academic Fellowship. Charles Malik was, again, in the 1930s, when that nefarious movement was coming from Frankfurt, Germany. Well, Malik had to get out of Germany too, and he went over to Harvard, but he was a Christian. And he was studying under Whitehead, and he was studying under other famous atheists and so forth. And he did his PhD in philosophy. And to date, he's got the Guinness Book of World Records, I think, of the number of honorary doctorates, over 50. He was the UN Declaration or the UN Secretary General. He was the senior architect on the UN Declaration of Human Rights and a card-carrying Christian. And he gave a lecture 40 years ago at Wheaton College on the two tasks, redeeming the soul and redeeming the mind, where he went on to talk about the mind of Western culture is the university. And he put that as the pinprick on the map and said, this is what we have to do. As go the universities, so goes the culture. As go the U.S. universities, so goes the world. And so we started a funding arm where we could recruit really solid evangelistic thinkers that are just getting into or starting at an R1 university. And why R1? Again, because they're going to be the first round draft choice for the job markets.
Right.
But our mission for these guys is not only to develop them into not professors who happen to be Christians, but Christian professors, missional professors, so that they go off and have a 40-year career with 15,000 or more students and leave a legacy. But more importantly, that they launch Christian PhD student-only chapters at these highest level schools, so that in 40 or 50 years, we can do what the other side has been doing, and we can reclaim, through this long march of the institutions, the intellectual voice of Christ back in these institutions that we Christians founded.
Cool. And it's important. I had a discussion last week with someone on this issue, and they were trying to argue that, well, we really need to start in the home, which we're going to talk about, but we'll change culture individually. And I said, well, yes, but your kids are going to go to school. They're going to see their teachers as more educated than you are, and they're going to be then trained with what they had learned in the universities. So if you don't tackle the universities, you're probably not going to get anywhere. You need to start with the thought shapers of culture, and they're in the universities.
Right. And I think David and I were together a couple of weeks ago. I did a podcast with Dr. James Torr. This guy is
Right.
one of the top 10 chemists in the world, top 50 most influential scientists. And he said during both the podcast and when I was teaching in his Sunday school class, which is the size of a church, at his church in Houston, he said both times that he took his parenting seriously. He woke his 4 kids up every single day at 5:30 a.m. Most Christians don't get up that early by themselves to do devotions, but he did with his whole family for decades. And he's a top scientist. And yet, he said, when 2 of my 4 kids, 50% of them, went off to the university, they had their worldviews rocked.
Right.
There is science, there is history, there is philosophy, different angles on this whole area of apologetics, defending the faith. This new revolution is the philosophical.
It
and
is.
This is so subtle. Most people don't catch it. Most, not just pastors and parents, but even a lot of our philosophers. I'm convinced that the reason why this stuff got in and got past our gatekeepers in the philosophical community
Right.
is because most of those people are trained in a particular tradition, in
Right.
analytic philosophy. But this is not analytic philosophy. This is continental philosophy. It comes from the thinkers on the continent, on the European continent. And a lot of us who are trained in analytical philosophy looked at that stuff and just thought, it's a waste of time. It's not even really doing true philosophy. They don't care about logic. They don't care about the pursuit of truth. They're just social activists there. Let it die the death of a lack of oxygen. But they did not see what was coming. I saw it when I was at Purdue studying Marxism in a full graduate program with a distinguished professor of philosophy, a Marxist. I saw what was happening there, and I predicted what was coming next. And that's why one of our first booklets in our Novum series that we put out there to train parents and pastors and things like that was on this issue of critical theory and cultural Marxism, because it was coming out really fast. People weren't recognizing it. Everything moves from the campus to the culture, and that's exactly what happened.
Right.
Well, and we even see this from, so it's not just a secular thing, because Pete Enns, the famous progressive Christian scholar, in, I want to say it was 2022 or so, just a couple of years ago at the Wild Goose Festival, he flat out said that one of his goals as a professor is to cause a crisis of faith in his students. That's his goal. Now, I agree that every Christian should face a period of that separating from this is the faith of my parents to this is my faith. But there is a vast difference between, my goal is to cause you to, question everything you had. And my goal is to mature you into your own independent thinker who's not merely following in your parents' footsteps for the sake of following in them, but because they have chosen that path for themselves. So going on, well, first of all, do you have more you want to say about either the Malik Fellowship or professors?
Well, and I think that Peter Enns also, I thought, give him 10 years and he's going to become Bart Ehrman. And as of 2020, the last time I checked, maybe he labels himself an agnostic Christian.
I haven't seen the agnostic part, but with progressive Christianity embracing literal atheist leaders as Christian, I'm like, it would not surprise me in the least.
Yeah. Well, for the Malik Academic Fellowship, if people are listening and either they know of quality PhD students who could be candidates for us, send them my way. If they know or have affluence themselves enough to help fund this, this is the top of the food chain, the professors. And I call it the 1040 window of the Western world. It is the greatest omission of the Great Commission if we miss discipling and reaching the professors. They are the largest, most influential, largest unreached people group, and they are having our children and grandchildren for lunch.
Yeah.
Right. And not only, not only them at the university level, but their educational progeny, their offspring, who then goes on to high school, junior high school, etc., to carry on these same ideas that they learned at the university level.
Yeah, there's so many people that say, well, I think we need to start earlier than college. And I say, well, great. Yes, we do need to do that too. But my daughter, she didn't choose IU. Thank God. I taught there. She chose Purdue, which is more commonsensical among public universities because, 1 out of 3 of their students are engineering students and the bridges still have to stay up. So 2 + 2 still equals 4 there.
Right.
And so you've got some common sense there. And yet, she's an elementary ed major. And I ask her each semester, to show me her syllabi for her courses that she's going to be teaching third graders. And whether she goes into a public school or decides to go into a K through 12 or K through 6 Christian school, she's going to be taking what I'm seeing in that syllabi,
Right.
which is cultural Marxism.
Right.
Now, she has a father like me that has studied this stuff, and I can smell it where it exists. But not everybody will have that. And so
Right.
even the Christians that are going to get an elementary ed teaching degree, and then they go back in, where are the K through 12 coming from? The universities. Where are the pastors coming from? The universities. Where are the political leaders, the business leaders, the doctors, dentists, the media? They're all coming from the universities. And so as goes the universities, so goes the culture. And it's not just here. It's such an opportunity for us to reach. 1 in 3 of all world leaders has earned an academic degree from a U.S. university. And when we take our kids and we send them off to universities, the statistics of those who go to church weekly in America is 30%. Almost weekly is 39%, but 39% of 18 to 24-year-olds are enrolled in college. And you go to church weekly and you get 52 sermons a year. If you go to college, you get 60 sermons your first month. Right. We have to go after the universities. And this Malik Academic Fellowship is one high road effort that not a lot of people are making. And so again, if people are listening, they can help, want to help, please talk to us, because this is the long march through the institutions and it must be done.
Okay, so university professors, very important. And that's your area of, that's what Ratio Christi does, is works at the universities.
Yeah, the majority report of what we do is undergraduates, and we have a high school division as well. But yeah, we work at universities. Even our high school college prep is designed to prepare those who are getting ready to go off to the secular baptismal font, so that what doesn't happen is the parents and grandparents train their kids in the way they should go. And when they get older, they get conscripted to work for Bart Ehrman and Peter Enns and Alfred Kinsey.
Right. Now, something that's close to my heart, and you and I have talked about this a lot in the past, are pastors. Sometimes pastors feel like we're sort of assaulting them because they're very, very busy, as you and I both know. You've been a pastor, I've been a pastor. You have a lot on your plate. You have a lot of people wanting your time, needing your time, whatever. But I believe, and David brought this up, he agrees, that the pastor needs to have or be developing an apologetics culture in the church. What would that look like, in your opinion?
Most of them, and I know we've all talked about this, most pastors, I don't think, like apologetics, even though it's not only back in demand sociologically by our own Barna sociologists, but it's always been a command in 1 Peter 3:15. So you want to follow Jesus, you ought to obey Jesus' commands. Jesus said, if you love me, keep my commands. Well, it was a command that Peter gave, but Jesus authorized Peter. But something else Jesus addressed was that when someone asked him, teacher, what's the greatest command? And he said what it was. And then flowing from his lips were, love God with all your heart, soul, and heart. No, heart, soul, and mind. And so our pastors need to become more of what they have historically been for the first 1900 years of the Christian church, not the last 100 years, which is fairly scandalous, where we are more apt to follow sociology and culture rather than theology and scripture. And we follow the latest fad for a church growth movement, be it skinny jeans or fog machines or whatever else it's going to be. They need to be equipping the parents to equip their students. They need to equip their flocks to address the current ideological current that's out there in culture and at university and on the workforce, on the factory floor, and that's not always happening. So they don't like the word apologetics. We changed for rhetorical purposes many years ago our vision statement to address the pastors because we were feeling a sense of hostility by the university administrators who we constantly are having to give a continuing education about the Constitution and win every time. But now we find this hostility from many of the pastors, not hospitable, not a kind of a hospitality in the churches, but a hostility toward Christian apologetics. And so we decided to call it like discipleship, right? We decided to change the title of our vision to Thoughtful Christianity, transforming lives on campus today, changing culture tomorrow, where the transformation is Romans 12, 1 and 2. After all the doctrine, he says, okay, what next? What do we do now about all of this stuff in Romans? And he talks about that being transformed by the renewing of your mind, following Jesus again, loving God with your mind. But thoughtful Christianity, when we say that word thoughtful, we think about a person who is compassionate and considerate, but also rational and reflective. And so I think we need to be able to speak the lingo of many of our pastors. We need to encourage them to step it up in ways that the first 1900 years of pastors did, and all of the university presidents for the first 2 centuries in America were also members of the clergy. But we need to encourage them. It's a tough job. We need to encourage them to be the pastors, to be all they can be and must be in light of the culture. But in order to even gain a hearing with the pastors, we have to use a rhetoric that they're going to appreciate. And I think that's where we came along with thoughtful Christianity. We started talking about discipleship, evangelism, more relevant evangelism for our culture. So cultural evangelism, not even using the word cultural apologetics with them, but cultural evangelism, because otherwise you're not going to get a second date. And we do this stuff, right? If you go on a date, you want a second date, you at least wear deodorant. It's not denying that you don't have BO, but you want to cover over it so that you can get a second date. You go to an interview, a job interview, you don't wear your sweats. It doesn't deny that you do wear sweats, but you want a second interview. If you want to have for Christian apologetics or Christians who love to love God with their mind and not just their hands and their heart, they want to be fully devoted Christians, as Jesus said, then we need to think about not just rhetorical apologetics for non-believers, but we need to think about a rhetorical wordsmithing to be able to talk with our shepherds.
Yeah, that's really important. One of the things that I generally try to do when I have young apologists kind of up and coming is to point out that apologetics has kind of a bad rap, and I think deservedly so, because apologists, we are high maintenance. We've been accused of being high maintenance, and that's true. We have red pencil personalities. No, that's wrong. But we need to be careful about that, because some, and there are some, who will fight at the drop of a hat, and they'll gladly drop the hat.
Yeah.
that is not necessarily what we need to have. Thoughtful Christianity, we need to be able to ask good questions, talk about worldviews. Pastors, we need to earn pastors' trust. If they earn your trust, they're going to be more likely to be interested in your serving in some capacity. So I have that at my church. We've talked about that. I have very, very, very good relationship with my pastor. It happens he likes apologetics, but he calls me regularly. He goes, "There's no way I could do what you could do." So he leaves me to do what I do because that's what I do best. And many of those kinds of questions, when they come into him, he says, "I want you to talk with Don," and I'll give him my phone number, and we handle whatever it is that comes up. And not every church has that kind of a person. Is there a way, in your opinion, to help pastors understand that maybe they don't have someone apologetically trained in their congregation, but might want to be trained because they, as a pastor, may not be called in that area?
Sure. And like David said, a cultural of apologetics in the church. You've got people who appreciate the life of the mind in the church. Not all people need that. And look, we even tell people in our organization, just like the Stoic philosopher Epictetus said, we have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason, so that we listen more. We need to listen and diagnose not just the culture of the sociology around us, but the culture of the psychology in individuals too. And if someone needs a hug, we give them a hug. If they need an argument, we are prepared to give them an argument. And so we know that this is happening in our culture. Our own sociologists are now telling us it's back in demand. And so, if people don't have time, and being a pastor is busy, being a parent's busy, you don't want to read a 500-page book like, say, that one on my shelf by Steve Myers, The Return of the God Hypothesis. Well, one of the things that Ratio Christi has done is to make this easy. And instead of reading 500 pages, why not start out with the booklet that we had him write for us, The Return of the God Hypothesis, which is only 25 pages. And we forced him to get his readability down to the 11th grade reading level. So we have professors over at Purdue who want to read this stuff. We have high schoolers that want to read this stuff. We have parents and pastors that can read this stuff. It's the reading level of the New American Standard Bible, the 11th grade reading level. And it's not just on the sciences. We have these color-coded. If you want them on the Bible, lost in translation, how do we know they're reliable? If you want them on the cultural issues like transgenderism, the author being formerly trans herself and did a PhD on it and gave us her 200-page book in 25 pages. Or what about capitalism and communism, right? Written by an economist and one of our faculty advisors. I mean, this stuff, last week, the Congress voted on whether or not to condemn socialism. And in the Democratic Party, only 40% could do so. 60% refused to condemn it.
Right.
And then a month ago, the Gallup poll that's been tracking this for 15 or 20 years showed that 66% of those who self-identify as Democrats embrace socialism more than capitalism.
Right.
So if you don't think this is an issue out there, look again. And then, what about the God in the Bible? Is he evil? What about genocide and slavery in the Bible and things like that? So we've got all these things color-coded. There's no excuse. And we've gone beyond this now too. These are the 25-page versions of the 500 pagers. And if people want more, the authors in the back give you the 500 pagers. But now we even have 8 pagers on the top 6 issues. So who can't read 8 pages?
Right.
So you need to equip your people.
Right. I have never done any actual surveys. I just have anecdotal evidence, but it seems to me that when I do speak in churches that are just sort of being introduced to this, easily 10% of the people come up to me and they'll say, I need to learn about this. I'm fascinated by this. I never even knew this existed before. So you have people who already would be interested if they even knew about this.
I'm
Is-
sorry. Your viewers are not going to like that sunshine.
Oh, you had good light on the subject. I noticed that. So there's resources available even for the pastor who is not necessarily intrigued or interested by being an apologist, because it's not for everybody, for sure. But to help their people understand that there are resources if you're interested where you can learn this, and thereby you have someone else developed in the church that's going to volunteer to do ministry in your church in this area, who may not get involved with anything else.
Right. Every church should have someone that's addressing these issues. At least one person. At least one person.
Yeah.
Well, and if we just look at statistics, average congregation size, if we look at a minimum of 100 people, if 1 or 2% of the church have an interest in this, you've got 1 or 2 people in every single church, just statistically speaking, that would want to do this. But I've also found this, and this is across all of my years in a variety of different churches and talking with everyone. Even when we get churches that have the resources and have the size, for some reason there's a resistance. Even when you have people who are like, yes, we're in this, and they've been in the church for years. I haven't figured out why, but for some reason there's a resistance to shifting it from the individual that's passionate about it to we as a church are going to take this seriously. And that's something that I would love to see change. And
well, I think about this as you brought this up, David, about a culture of apologetics. Something that just occurred to me is that, in the first century, it became a practical need that we needed to have deacons so that the elders could focus on their thing, so that the pastor can be preaching and teaching. But what do our deacons do? Do they vacuum, the sanctuary carpets? Do they help the widows? Okay. Maybe you have a deacon over the youth ministries or education. Why not have just one deacon or deaconess, a servant, where that's their area of focus? Bring on a deacon to do something other than what all of the rest of them are doing, the food pantry and the Sunday school and vacuuming and other things. Why not add one deacon? Why not one person? Mm-hmm. So it doesn't have to be, we are the apologetics church. No, it's that we're concerned that our church loves God with our mind because Jesus said so.
Well, and they are the ones that can also then keep up with what is the current trends in Christian books that are coming out.
Right.
It's pretty rare that, because it comes from a Christian publisher, quote unquote, it's regarded usually by church leadership as safe. It's been theologically vetted or whatever. And I have to tell you, that isn't true. The academics may be, because they're going to be vetted by other academics, peer pressure sort of thing. But in the popular level, it doesn't happen. I discovered this when we started working on our Bill Gothard book, and started talking with Zondervan, and they had nobody who looked at the theology in the popular level books. They looked for typos, punctuation, will we get sued? Those kind of questions. And I asked him, I said, oh, no, Gwen Shamblin. Yeah, it was Gwen Shamblin when her book came out. That's what it was. And she has this whole description of God as just basically a large, good-looking human being, a heavenly Bill Gibson, I called him, who wanted everyone to have a choice. And so to make it fair choosing between him and Satan, he was so handsome, so good-looking, so athletic that he made himself invisible so that people could then make a better choice. But then he discovered he had made a bad decision because everyone was choosing Satan instead of him. And so he had to resort to a duel, a boxing match. And I said, do you not realize the book that you're promoting, at that point they had sold over almost 250,000 copies, that they're teaching a God who is essentially a large, heavenly Mel Gibson who's not bright. They said, we never saw that. I said, you didn't read it for theology, did you? No, we just want to know if it would sell.
Well, I went to a major apologetics conference back 5 or 6 years ago, I think. And by major, I mean, I think it was about 1,500, maybe 2,000 people attending. Elisa Childers was one of the speakers. I think Monique Duson was another speaker. And I go to the bookstore and they had contracted out with someone else, to run a book sales thing. And it wasn't a publisher house. It was just someone that, set up all the tables and everything. And I go through and I take a look at the books as I always do. And I see Rachel Held Evans sitting there. And I'm like, wait a minute.
Right.
And I took a look and, I made the right comments to the right people and it was removed very quickly. But it was like, well, the book, if you don't pay attention to, the book calling God she, then, you don't notice any issues. But yeah, there's so much stuff out there that sounds authentic and that looks authentic that unless I'm convinced. I was raised in the church. I was raised, missionary kid, Christian or private Christian schools, everything. I'm convinced that if I had read Richard Rohr before I studied apologetics, I would have fallen hook, line, and sinker.
Absolutely.
His book the Universal Christ has more scripture in it than most evangelical books.
Right.
And unless you actually pay attention to certain things and you've been, you've learned, hey, this is significant. Yeah, it's so easy to miss that. And that's why not everyone is called to doing these deep studies, but every Christian is called to understand that threats are out there.
Right.
And know where to go to get help.
Right. So just quickly, I want to correct. It wasn't Zondervan. It was Thomas Olson Publishers. The Gwen Shellman's book. So, and you're right. If you had not been understood apologetics when you read his book, it's very deceiving, as are many. So someone in that frame of mind, it can be valuable to the church if the church will allow them. A culture of apologetics is imperative, I think, even if the pastor and even the elders are not inclined to be the apologists. They need to encourage someone to do that they trust. Another option is for several churches, if you're smaller churches, to unite together and financially support a local apologetics ministry that can serve several churches at once, as another option. So there's things that can be done, but be creative. Right. Now, Dave brought up parents. What should parents do, in your opinion?
Well, they are delegated by Scripture to be the primary educators of their own children. So in the same way that deacons emerged early on because there was a practical need, so we had this thing called youth pastors that emerged very early on, like 1900 years later.
yeah, right, yeah.
For a practical need, and that was America was becoming increasingly post-Christian, and we had many many kids that had parents that weren't Christ followers anymore, and we had our Christian kids who may befriend them, and we thought, let's make these things called youth groups, and let's hire a youth pastor, and that moved from focusing on outreach for those non-Christian kids to now in-reach to our own Christian kids. And then after a while, the parents both just thought, well, why don't we just have the youth pastor raise our kid until he's 18 years old, and then we just pay for his college? Not really, but that practically what's been happening. And whether it's driven by feminist ideology, whether it's driven by economic disparity, whatever the reasons are, both parents are now working full-time in probably most homes if they're married. And you want to make ends meet, but then you're exhausted by the time you get home. You cook dinner, you want to, relax a little bit, go to bed, and do the same rat race all over again. And so having a youth pastor has been so convenient, it's led to our destruction. Yeah. Because the parents no longer disciple their kids. And I talk with professors. I've got, several stories. Well, not just professors. I've talked with other people in campus ministry that have come back to me later than they wanted to and said, don't ever make my mistake. What was that? I was so busy discipling other people's kids that I forgot to disciple my own. And now they've all gone off and none of them are following Christ. So whatever the case is, your parenting delegation, your charge by God is to raise up godly offspring.
Yes.
And
Right.
that means you need to be the ones to understand the Bible and the culture around you so that you can protect them, and not just protect them for survival, but to cultivate them. That talk about an apologetics culture in the church. How about in the home? You create a culture, you cultivate this love for the mind and interacting with ideas on the outside. And so I have taken that seriously myself, and whether it's Lee Strobel's middle school level apologetics on the case for Christ, the case for a creator, or whatever, I always go out with one of my kids after church, and we go to Panera Bread or something like that, and we'll go through chapters on that, and it's father-daughter, father-son time. But I get them not in the same way that David said Peter Enns wants to do, creating a crisis moment, but I want to expose them. I want to give them a little bit of a flu shot, so that when they are exposed to the influenza, they overcome it. And so I want to expose them to what's coming. That
Right.
presupposes I know what it is.
Right.
So when the Apostle Paul says, beware of false philosophy, you first have to become aware in order to beware. And so it's just the parents need to be loving God with their minds. They
Right.
may not be ingesting skinny jeans and fog machines for programmatic purposes at home. But if they're not doing their jobs and then they think, I'm just going to pay their tuition, you're literally going to pay for the apostasy of your own children. And
Right.
I cannot tell you, being a person on the lecture circuit, how many parents I have everywhere I go, almost every talk I give, that come up after and tell me a sad story about their son or daughter when
Right.
they went off to the university.
Right.
You have a chance to equip them to not just survive, but to thrive.
Right.
And if you don't take that chance, train them up in the way they should go, and when they get older, they will likely get conscripted to work for the other side.
Well, one of the things that happened with my kids is they grew up in a house of two apologists. And so it's how we lived our life. We talked to the radio, we talked to the TV, we talked to everything. And my son, I think it was 7, maybe at one point, he looked at his mom who was doing whatever, and he said, Mom, you're always trying to get to the point of everything. Well, that's true. We are always trying to get to the point of everything. But they grew up with that mindset, and they understood how to ask good questions of whatever was coming on from an early age. But not all parents are going to be able to do that. I have to understand it. It just happened to be what we were. We have 3 questions under parents, and we'll do this as quickly as we can because we don't run over too far. But David put these together, and I appreciate him sending them over. So I'll read them off, and we'll see where they go. Number 1, how do we examine universities for fidelity or known concerns? Number 2, how do we equip our children to first understand and then combat these threats that they'll run into at the university? 3, how do we partner with our pastors as a parent? Ready, set, go.
And so the first one, how do we identify problem issues at various universities?
Yep.
So you just assume that if the highest university is hiring a drag queen as a professor, it's probably
That's telling, yeah.
at most of them, right?
Yeah.
Because everybody wants to be like Harvard, and that's what Harvard is doing now. So you've just got to assume that the universities, I've said this before, but for people just listening to this episode, the latest ratios I put in my book of liberal to conservative are 23-1 for those who just got tenure and have decades ahead of them. If you want your kids to go to the Ivy Leagues, it's 27-1. And the higher you go up the pecking order, the worse it gets. You just have to assume that the majority of what your kids are going to get is going to be subversive to your Christian thought at some point or other. And because part of what makes something persuasive is not just the logic, the logos, but also the ethos and the pathos. If a professor comes through as charismatic, he's got this empathy or sympathy and resonates with his audience, he's captured the kids. The ethos, the character, the competence, the credibility, they have the PhD. They're automatically outgunning the parents who maybe work 9 to 5 at a job, maybe have a master's degree. And that's not a PhD, and that's not a specialization in some field. And
Right.
that's not saying that almost every professor your kid encounters is going to be saying the same thing from one discipline to the next.
Right.
You don't stand a chance if you can't give them the critical thinking skills and the wherewithal to be able to find the resources when they need it to go off. So you just have to assume that the universities are doing that. And sadly, you have to assume that most Christian universities are now doing some of the same. And I can name names, do so a little bit in the book, but it's much easier not to sit here all day and name all the Christian universities. It's much easier just to name the 2 or 3 in
Very
all
good.
of American Christian universities that are squeaky clean and don't have any of this Marxism stuff going on, critical race theory, LGBT stuff. It's happening. And if parents are naive about that, we can get them resources on that. You just have to assume that the universities are doing that. That's all. Second one was briefly again.
How do we equip our children to first understand and then combat the threats that they're going to face at the university?
Again, I love the bonding experiences, because at some point, I'm now reading books on how to relate with your adult children, right? Right. You're going to have to do that. And I'm now, at that kind of level. And it's going to be grounded in the relationship that you have and in their respect for you, that they're going to be coming back to you. So, you are establishing an open dialogue kind of relationship to be able to talk to you about anything, to be able to ask questions about anything. And if they don't know the questions to ask, again, I'm not doing this like Peter Enns intended to, but I do want to inoculate them a little bit. So I know what's happening in the culture. And so I'll say, hey, honey, what do you think? Or, hey, son, what do you think about this issue? I just saw this article. Look at your phone, because they have their phone. And I say, what do you think about this? What's a Christian view on that? How would we respond? Or what if your friends came up to you? And so we'll talk about those things that are in their world, not just in my world. And I'm trying to give them exposure to what they're about to hit when they're outside of the safety and comfort of our conversations. I want them to be able to think critically, not just indoctrinate proper beliefs. I want them to know why they believe what they believe, and to be able to understand how to wrestle through issues.
Right.
So that's the second. The third one, how can a parent gain the ear of a pastor?
Yeah, partner with the pastors, especially in these areas.
I mean, if the parent is the one who has sympathy for our cause that we've been talking about today, they could go suggest a deacon role for themselves. Doesn't even have to be an elder role. And it gets the pastor off the hook from having to do it and having to admit guilt that his church is a church that loves God with hands and heart, but not head. So it's a way to bring added value. I want to bring added value to you. I've noticed there are a lot of people that have got these questions. I know it takes a lot of time. Not everyone's an area expert. I'd like to help in this. I would suggest possibly this. Would you be okay with that? Right? Or I'm going to meet with the youth pastor, and with your seniors, I want to help you equip them for going off into college. I do a lot of thinking about this. And so maybe we can meet together and we can do reading discussion groups. That's what we do with our professors. We just don't call them reading discussion. They're engineers over there at Purdue anyway. They call them R&D groups, right? They do research and development.
Yeah.
We'll just do that. And they're reading and discussion groups. And all we do is go through these booklets. You don't have to be a parent that knows all this stuff.
Right.
You don't have to get the N.T. Wright 500, 700 page book or the Steve Meyer 700 page book. You don't even have to know the 25 pagers. You just read them with your flocks, with your families, or with your friends and discuss them. That's all. It's
Right.
not hard. You don't have to be a big researcher, and you're going to grow in this as well.
Right. Right. So I have one other question, and then I want to mention some resources. The question comes in from the California or the Colorado Caffeinated crew, good friends of ours. Dr. Miller, what are your thoughts on the value of college education these days? Should we be investing in these institutions?
In some of them, if you are selling your soul and all your friends' souls and your grandkids' souls. I have a chapter in my book that addresses philanthropists and donors. Stop funding those who hate you. We need to start funding those who are not just our team that we graduated from because we have a Purdue shirt or something like that. And I just came from a Purdue basketball game, so I've got a Purdue dad shirt here. Just because that's my tribe for basketball, or I graduated from there, or my daughter's over there. I shouldn't be funding organizations that I know have a subversive intellectual perception that they're throwing on us. Some of them are better than others. Some Christian universities may be worthwhile, some secular ones in certain departments. But what about our own kids? Should we be investing in them going? Look, if it's women's studies, absolutely not. Gender studies, queer studies that are being taught by the transgender drag queen professor at Harvard. No, you shouldn't be doing that. Why would you do such a silly thing? But medicine, you're never going to become an MD if you don't. Law, you're not going to be doing that, and that's an influential field. Engineering, 6 out of 10 of the most high-paying jobs coming out are engineers. You need to have usually a degree in that area, and usually those are common sense degrees. So you need to just ask practical questions about the value, not of higher ed itself, but of particular areas in higher ed. And I don't discourage people from going into the humanities. I want our people to go back in there and to get PhDs and to take back the universities.
Right.
That is a long road to do so. And there is risk. There is risk of not getting jobs as well. So are they a good investment? That's going to be a case by case basis and a situational basis. But there are certain degrees, certain universities, certain pathways, absolutely not. There is a lot of room now for people keeping their kids sane from these crazy places, especially in the humanities and social sciences, and having them go off and get trade work now. But the church needs to prepare for what's coming out, and that is we are looking at the demographic feminization of the universities, so that more females are enrolled in college, are enrolled in graduate school, are enrolled in PhD programs, dominate the assistant professor landscape, and within 10 years will dominate the entire professor landscape. The way that males and females are different will change the university thought processes and the way we address problems as well. And to the degree that coming out with a degree or a higher degree corresponds to a higher wage, if that continues to happen, we will inevitably face the issue, even within Christian couples, that the woman is going to be the breadwinner. And then how does one stay at home and educate the kids or whatever? These are practical problems that we need to address. And that is a practical consideration when you're asking, should we invest in our kids in going into universities? You don't get the best paying jobs necessarily. Some of them you do, but others you could do better going off on a trade and keeping your kid away from debt.
Right. All right. Well, Corey, so as we kind of wrap this up, we just want to say a few things really quickly. One, all of our information for David, for Corey, for myself is in the description at below. David is the is currently assistant. It just ran right out of my brain.
Assistant executive director.
Executive director, assistant executive director of EMNR. You can contact him. There's a number of organizations that would be glad to serve you and your church, and they're listed on the website emnr.org. You can contact me. I'm the current president of EMNR. I'm also president of Midwest Christian Outreach Inc., which is a mission to cults and non-Christian religions. And maybe some of the universities are cults, so that might fit in there too. But so you can contact us for information. We would like to help families and churches to the best of our ability. Corey Miller, Ratio Christi. Corey, what is the website for Ratio Christi? It's also listed, but what is it?
It's like mathematical ratio Christi, Christ with an I.org. RatioChristi.org. If you want to look at the book, you can just go to ratio.link/PMA for Progressive Miseducation of America. Ratio.link/PMA. You can invite me to come speak to your campus, your church, your conference. You can look at our booklets from there. You can navigate to our full website from there as well.
Absolutely. And Jen R56 adds in, we need plumbers, electricians, and carpenters and other tradespeople. It is a fine profession. I was in construction for 40 years, and I did just fine there. So, all right, great. You guys, thank you for being with us. For those who are watching, if you need anything, contact us. We want to serve you well. Say goodnight, guys.
Thanks, gentlemen.